The room was 11 feet by 12. I measured it once, boot heel to boot heel, because I'm the kind of man who needs a number before he'll believe a thing. One door, one window facing east, because she asked for east. A dirt floor Cal reader swept himself the night before he brought her home. That's all it was. A man who couldn't read built a woman a room so she'd have 4 walls that nobody could take back. He was dead inside of 2 years. And the strange part, the part I still can't put right in my head, 60 years and a bad hip later, is that she didn't leave. She should have left. Everybody with sense said she'd leave. The territory said she had no claim, the army said she had no business, and the land agent out of Silver City said a woman like her couldn't hold a rock, let alone ground. She stayed. And by the time I was too old to sit a horse, there were 400 souls living on that flat, and a schoolhouse, and cottonwood somebody had to plant on purpose. And men came from 3 counties and stood at the edge of it with their hats in their hands and said, "I'd give anything to live here." Anything. They didn't know what it cost her. I know I wrote it down. That's the thing about this country nobody tells you. It'll be blue overhead, hard, mean blue, the kind that makes your eyes ache. And 40 miles north in the Mogollons the sky is falling apart and you don't know it, and the water comes down the cut like a train that lost its tracks. No warning. No sound until there's too much sound. I was on the high side with the wagon, and Cal Reeder was on the low side with 11 head of mixed cattle and 1 stubborn bay mare. And between us was a channel of dry sand maybe 40 feet wide that we had crossed, the both of us, 100 times. I hollered. I want that written plain because I've had a long life to lie about it and I've decided not to. I hollered, and it did not matter one particle. He turned. He heard me, I think. He got one arm up, not waving, more like a man checking the wind, and then there wasn't any Cal there anymore, just brown water full of mesquite roots and a fence post from God knows where, and a bawling that stopped. I sat on that wagon seat for what my tally book says was 1 hour and 40 minutes. I know because I wrote it down. I have written down every damn thing since I was 19 years old, times and weathers and the price of flour, on account of my father drank his memory away, and I decided I would have one thing he didn't. June 14, rain 0 in, water in Cañada Seca 4 p.m., see reader in it. 4 words for a man. I've never forgiven myself the arithmetic of that. I found him 2 miles down, hung up in a tangle of dead cottonwood, and he had lost a boot and his hat and the whole of his color. His hands were closed. That's what I remember. He'd gone under holding onto something and come out the other side still holding it, and there was nothing in his fists but silt. I got him in the wagon bed and I put my coat over him because it seemed like the thing. And then I sat down in the sand and was sick, and then I got up and drove 5 miles east to the room. I'd been there twice, both times I'd stayed on the horse. Cal built it himself out of adobe he made in a pit he dug with a shovel and a mule, and if you know anything about adobe you know it is honest work and slow. He was a poor mason. The corners weren't square. The lintel over the door was a piece of wagon tongue he'd traded 4 days' labor for, and it had somebody else's initials burned in it, which he never sanded off. He said the initials had come a long way and might as well stay. 1 room, 11 by 12. Cal Reeder had 260 acres of grass he had no legal paper for, 41 cattle, a bad knee, no letters, and one thing in the world he was certain of. And I'd heard him say it in a saloon in Hillsboro with 3 whiskeys in him and no shame at all. I don't want much. I want her to have some place they can't turn her out of. He never said who. He didn't need to. She was Apache. Chiricahua, though I have learned since that this is a word we made up and pinned on people, and the people had their own way of saying who they were. She'd been at San Carlos and she had walked out of it, which I will tell you about later because I'm not ready to yet, and Cal found her at a trading post near Fort Thomas trading a woven basket for salt, and by all accounts he stood there like a fence post and forgot what he'd come in for. Her name I could never say right. I tried for a year. She'd correct me and I'd get the front of it and lose the back, and one evening she took the stick I was whittling and drew 4 marks in the dirt and said in English slow, "This one, this one, this one, this one," and then she looked up at me with a face I couldn't read at all and said, "You will say 3 of them, that is more than most." I wrote it in my book the only way my hand could shape it. Nadeshe. I'm sure it's wrong. I've spelled it that way for 6 decades because it's the only piece of her I ever got to keep in my own handwriting. Cal called her that too badly, and she let him. She was standing in the door when I came in with the wagon. Not on the step. In the door frame, one hand up on the wagon tongue lintel, and she had been standing there long enough that a horned lizard was sitting in the sun by her foot and hadn't bothered to run. I've thought about how she knew. I don't believe in signs, but the water had come through that country all afternoon and she'd have heard it, the way you hear a train 2 towns over, and Cal was late, and I have come to think that she had already done the whole business, the knowing, the sitting down with it, the standing back up. In the hour and 40 minutes I was still on that wagon seat, being sick, writing 4 words in a book. She looked in the wagon bed. She didn't make a sound. She put 2 fingers on his forehead and left them there a while, the way you'd test a stove, and then she took my coat off him and folded it and handed it back to me, and I remember standing there holding my own coat like a fool thinking, she folded it. Why in God's name did she fold it? She said, "Help me carry him." We carried him into the room, 11 by 12. There wasn't hardly space and we had to swing him, and I banged his shoulder on the doorframe and I said sorry out loud to a dead man, and she said, "He does not mind." And I understood that she was being kind to me, which I had not earned and did not want and have never gotten over. Now, here is where a man telling this in a saloon would say she wept and tore her hair, because that's the story people want about an Indian woman with a dead husband, or he'd say she was stone, which is the other story, the colder one, and both of them are lies invented by men who weren't in the room. What she did was this. She sat with him all night. She was singing very low, hardly more than breath, and I stayed outside with the horses because it was not mine to hear, and I heard some of it anyway, and it went through me like cold water goes through a horse trough, and I sat in the dirt with my back against the adobe and shook. Toward morning she cut her hair. I didn't see it. I heard the knife on it. And when the sun came up east through that window he'd put there because she asked, she came out and her eyes were swollen shut nearly, and her voice was ruined, and she said, "There is a spade behind." Then she said, "I will need you 2 more days." 2 more days, like a job of work, like a fence to be run. I stayed 11. Digging what I asked. She was down in a hole about waist deep, 40 feet from the room, throwing dirt over her shoulder with an economy of motion that told you she had done a great deal of hard work in her life and had learned the cheap way to do it. She didn't stop. She said, "Water." I said there wasn't water there. I said the water was in the cut, when it was anywhere, and the cut was a mile off and it would kill her too if she was standing in it wrong. She said, "There is water, it is deep." I said, "How do you know?" And she leaned on the shovel and pushed the hair, what was left of it, off her forehead with her wrist, because her hands were filthy, and she looked at that patch of ground like it was a person she was negotiating with, and she said, "The grass here is a different green." I want to tell you I saw it. I looked. I looked hard, standing there in the same sun, with the same 2 eyes, and it was all one color to me, the color of every miserable acre between there and the Rio Grande. She dug for 31 days. I know it was 31 because I wasn't there for most of them. I had freight to haul. I had my own poverty to feed, and every time I came back through I'd write it down. July 4, hole 9 FT. July 19, hole 22 FT, she has cribbed the walls with cottonwood. Aug 1, hole 34 FT, dry. Aug 3. That's all it says for August 3rd. I've looked at that page for 60 years. I remember I got there in the evening, and she was sitting on the pile of spoil with her arms hanging down between her knees and her hands. I have never seen hands like that on a living person. The blisters had broken and healed and broken again and gone past caring, and there was a rag around the left one, and the rag was black. And there was mud on her boots. Mud. I said her name badly, and she looked up and she was crying, and it was the first time, and it was not for Cal, and she said something in her language, and then she said in English, "It is under a rock shelf. I have to go around." Around 34 feet down. I sat next to her on the dirt pile, and I got out my book to write it, and my hand was shaking too much, and she watched me try 3 times, and then she reached over. She'd never touched me, not once, and she put her ruined hand flat on the page. She said, "Write that I found it, not that I was crying." I said, "I'll write both." And she laughed. God help me. She laughed, and it was an awful sound, and it was the first true thing that had happened on that flat since the 14th of June. The well came in at 38 feet, sweet, and it never once went dry in her lifetime, not in 86, not in 93, not in the drought that emptied Grant County and sent men walking east with their families behind them like a defeat. But I am getting ahead. In October, a man named Preston Awe came out from Silver City with a folding stool and a valise, and set up on the flat like he was fixing to paint a picture. He was a land agent. He had soft hands, and he was not a cruel man, and I want to be fair to him, because the cruelty I've seen in my life mostly comes in without a face on it, writing a piece of paper. He explained it to her twice. The first time he used long words, and she stood there with her chin down, listening in that way she had that made men think she didn't understand, and then find out later she'd caught every syllable and turned it over and found the crack in it. The second time he tried small words, loud. She said, "I heard you the first time." He got red. Then he said the thing. He said Cal Reeder had no patent on the land, only occupancy, and occupancy passed to a widow, and she was not a widow because there was no marriage recorded in any book in the territory. And even if there was, she was not a citizen, and a person who was not a citizen could not take land under the act, and there it was. 3 walls of a box. He was sorry. She said, "Where would I go?" He said, "The reservation, ma'am, is at San Carlos." I was standing by the wagon, and I heard her breathe, just once, in through the nose and out. If you have not been to San Carlos in those years, you must not tell me what she should have said. I have been. I hauled beef there twice in '84, and I made a decision after the second trip that I'd starve before I did it a third, and I did nearly starve, and I have never been sorry. She said no. And Preston Awe packed his little stool and said the law was the law, and he was right, and he rode off south, and the dust took a long while to come down because there was no wind that day at all. That winter she should have died. I mean it plainly. She had 11 cattle left of Cal's 41, and no dog, and no rifle worth the name. And there was a stretch in February where I couldn't get through with the wagon for 3 weeks, and I lay awake in a boarding house in Lake Valley with a full belly, thinking about a woman 30 miles off with a bag of corn and a hole in the ground full of water. When I finally got the wagon out there in March, I came over the rise expecting, I don't know, something bad. I'd rehearsed it. That's my failing. I rehearse the worst thing so it can't ambush me, and it ambushes me anyway from the other side. There was smoke from the chimney. And there was a second little structure going up, brush and mud, half-built, ugly as sin. And there was a woman in the doorway of the room who was not her. Ophelia Vargas was 34 years old, and she had come up from Chihuahua on foot in the winter with a 9-year-old girl and no coat, running from a man I never asked about. And she had lain down about a mile from that well to die, and had gotten up again because her daughter cried, and she had walked to the smoke. That's what people did later. They walked to the smoke. It got so a phrase went around this part of the country, and men said it without knowing where it started. Walk to the smoke. It meant when you have got nothing left, there is a place. Nadeshe had opened the door in the middle of the night to two people who could not do one thing for her. She had let a stranger and a child into 11 feet by 12. She had given up half the corn. And when I said to her in the spring that she'd been a fool, that she'd nearly starved for people who might have cut her throat, she looked at me a long moment. Then she said, "When I came out of San Carlos, I walked 11 nights. On the 6th night, a woman gave me a blanket. She did not know me. In the morning, she was gone." I said, "So you owed somebody?" She said no, she was scraping a hide and she didn't look up. There is no owing, there is only what a person does. I have turned that sentence over for 60 years like a stone in my pocket and worn it smooth, and I still don't know that I've got the bottom of it. By the summer of '84, there were 9 of them. Ophelia and Pillar. A man called Ozzie Merritt, Eugene, on paper, who had come out of the 9th Cavalry with a discharge and a right hand that would not close and no place in this world that wanted a black man who couldn't work a rope. Nadeshe watched him try to milk a goat for 4 minutes with one hand, and then she made him a thing out of a stirrup leather and a wooden dowel that let him grip, and he sat down in the dirt and put his face in his good hand and did not come up for a while. 2 Apache children, brother and sister, who had been at a school in Albuquerque where they cut your hair and beat you for your own tongue, and who had run, and who did not speak for 4 months, either language, and then one morning the boy said something to her at the well, and she answered him and neither of them made anything of it, and Ozzie told me later that he had to go stand behind the corral. An old Mexican man, Teodoro, who could graft fruit trees and had no teeth. A white boy named Silas, 19, dumb as a fence post and strong as a mule, who'd been left behind by a herd going north on account of he asked too many questions. And me off and on, driving up with a wagon of flour and lying about the price. That's when she started the ditch. Now I have to make you understand something about the acequia, because if you have not lived in dry country you will hear ditch and think nothing of it, and you will miss the whole of what this woman was. A well is a hole. Water sits in it. It waters you and your goats and your beans, and that's your life, and it is a small life, and it ends when you do. An acequia is an argument with the shape of the world. It is a channel that has to fall, or the water lies down and quits, but it can only fall about an inch for every 100 feet, or the water runs too fast and eats its own banks and you have made a gully instead of a ditch, and the country is full of men who made gullies. It has to go around every rise. It has to cross every low place, and where it crosses you build. It cannot be done with a shovel and a strong back. It has to be done with a strong back and a thing in your head that can see water going where there is no water, uphill from the low ground, in a curve, next year. She built 4 miles of it. She had no level. She used a wooden trough and a cup of water and a lot of walking. She'd set 2 stakes and go and lie down on her belly and sight along the ground with one eye shut, and men who came later and had schooling did not believe it until they surveyed it, and then they got quiet. She had Ozzie's one hand and Silas's stupid strength and Teodoro's old bones and Ophelia carrying rock in her skirt, and she had a woman's temper that came off her about twice a year like weather, and the rest of the time she had a patience that frightened me. It took 2 years and 7 months. I was there the day they let the water in. I'd like to say something fine about it. What actually happened is that the water came about 100 yards and stopped and sat, and puddled up against a low place none of us had seen, and Silas said, "Well, hell," and Nadeshe stood there looking at it with her arms folded. Then she took a shovel and cut the bank and let it out on the ground and wasted a whole day's water, and she said, "Now we can see where it wants to go." She let it out on the ground on purpose. She used her failure like a lamp. The second time it went the whole 4 miles in 11 hours and came out of the mouth of that ditch into a field they'd cleared, and the children ran alongside it screaming, and Ophelia stood in it barefoot in her good dress, and Ozzie Merritt sat down on a rock and put his hat over his face. And Nadeshe walked away. I followed her. I had no business. And she went up to the low rise where Cal was, and she sat down cross-legged next to the stones, and she talked to him for maybe a quarter of an hour in a language I did not have, and I stood off 100 feet with my hat in my hands feeling like a thief. When she came back down, her face was ordinary. She said to me, "Write in your book that the ditch runs." I said I already had. She said, "Write the date twice." They called it Cal's room. It started as a joke, because for a while the only fixed point on that flat was the 11 by 12, and when people gave directions they'd say out past Cal's room, and then wagons started coming, and by 89 there was a store of sorts and a corral and 40 people, and the name had set up like adobe and there was no unmaking it. She never called it that. When she said the name of the place she used her own word, which meant, she told me once, impatient like I was slow, which I was, the green that means water. That different green, the one I couldn't see. 40 people, then 60. Every one of them came with nothing, because the ones with something went to Silver City where there was money, and the ones with nothing walked to the smoke. Now here is the thing I have never been able to explain to anybody who wasn't there, and I've quit trying mostly. That place worked. Not out of goodness. Don't let me put a halo on it. There were fistfights, and there was a man run off in 91 for what he did, and there was a summer where Ophelia and Nadeshe did not speak to one another for 80 days over a matter of offense. Human beings. Ordinary, rotten, wonderful human beings. But the ditch made them. You cannot own an acequia. That's the trick of the thing, and I don't believe she planned it, and I have come to believe she did. Every man's water has to run past every other man's ground. If you steal, everybody below you knows by dinner time. If you don't clean your stretch in the spring, the whole 4 miles chokes. So once a year she made this. Everybody who drank from it went out with a shovel, the storekeeper and the drunk and the priest when we got one, and they walked the whole 4 miles and dug out the silt, and at the end of it they ate together, and the ones who didn't come didn't get water. That's all. That's the entire law of the place. Men rode out of Deming to look at it, rode out of Las Cruces. They'd stand at the top of the rise where Cal was buried and look down at 400 acres of green in a country the color of a dead lion, and the ditch running like a seam of silver through it, and the cottonwood somebody had to plant on purpose, and children in the water, and they would take their hats off without knowing they were doing it. And every so often one of them would find me. I was a fixture by then, an old freighter with a bad hip and a book, and he'd say, "Who owns it?" And I'd say, "Nobody." And he'd say, "Who runs it then?" And I'd point. And he'd look at a small Apache woman with cropped gray hair standing in a ditch to her knees, arguing with a 14-year-old boy about the placement of a headgate, and something would go across his face. Some of them laughed. Some of them didn't. Some of them stood there a long time, and I watched them do the arithmetic they'd been taught their whole lives, and I watched the arithmetic come out wrong, and I watched a few of them just set it down. Right there. Set down a thing they'd carried since they were boys. Those ones stayed. In the fall of 1893, a man named Halbert Voss bought 40,000 acres to the north and east and hired a lawyer. I met the lawyer. He was polite. He explained that the water in the Cañada Seca had been appropriated upstream, prior in time, prior in right, and that the settlement's diversion was without color of title, and that Mr. Voss was prepared to be generous. I said, "You'll never make it stick. She's been on that water 12 years. He said, "She has been on that water. She is a person to whom the courts of this territory have never yet extended the capacity to hold water rights. Do you understand the distinction?" I did. 60 people, a ditch, a schoolhouse with a bell traded off a wrecked wagon, a woman who could not, in the eyes of any book in that territory, own the ground she was standing on. I rode out to tell her. It was October and the cottonwoods were going gold, the ones she'd planted, and she was sitting on the step of the room. The original room, 11 by 12, which was by then a storehouse for seed corn, and which nobody had ever once suggested tearing down. And she was mending a bridle, and the sun was coming in the east window behind her and coming out the door around her, and I stood there in the dooryard and could not say it. She said without looking up, "Say it." And I said it. She was quiet a long while, long enough that the light moved. Then she said a strange thing. She said Cal could not read. I said I knew. She said he signed his name with a mark. When he made this room, a man told him he must file a paper. He walked to Hillsboro 4 days. He put his mark on the paper and came back, and he was proud of it for a year. She pulled the awl through the leather. The paper was for a mining claim. The man had laughed at him. He never knew. I never told him. I didn't know what to say. She set the bridle down. He built me a room they could not take, she said. They could always take it. He did not know that, and he built it anyway, and I have lived in it 12 years. She looked up at me then, and I have never in my life been looked at like that, before or since, and I am 91 years old. Now I will build a thing they cannot take, she said, not because of a paper. I said, then how? And she said, because too many people will be standing in it. She was wrong. That's the part I have to tell you, and I don't want to, and my hand hurts and it's late. She was wrong, and she was right, and the ways she was each are the reason I have not been able to sleep a whole night since 1894. Because on the 4th of November that year, at dusk, when the ditch was low and the cottonwoods were bare, and Voss's riders had already cut the headgate once and been let alone about it, a man came down off the north ridge on a horse that was finished, and fell off it about 100 feet from the well. He was Apache. He had been shot through the meat of the thigh, and it was 4 days old, and it stank. Ozzie Merritt got to him first and turned him over and hollered for her, and she came out of the room with a lamp, and she stopped so hard that the lamp swung, and the shadows all went the other way across the ground. I was there. I had my book in my coat. I did not write anything down that night. Behind him, north, past the ridge, there was a light on the sky that was not the moon. She knelt in the dirt and took his face in both her ruined hands, and she said a name. And 60 people stood in a half circle in the dark, and every one of them understood before she said one word more that the whole thing, all of it, the ditch and the cottonwoods and the bell and the schoolhouse and the different green, every bit of it now rested on what one woman was going to do with her brother. Ozzie said, "Quiet, ma'am." She didn't hear him. The horse got up. Nobody caught it. It stood there shaking. Hat's not the same as not knowing it. I knew it. She said it 3 times that night in the dooryard, once kneeling, once with her mouth against his hair, once so quiet I only saw her lips do it. And I stood there with a leather book in my coat pocket and my thumb on the strap, and I did not take it out. I have told myself for 60 years it was decency. It wasn't. It was arithmetic. I'd already done it standing there. I'd already thought, if there's a name in my book and a soldier reads it, 60 people go hungry. I thought that before I thought one thing about her. So he came into the story with no name, and he leaves it the same way. And that is my doing, and I want it written down plain the way I wrote The Price of Flour. They carried him inside. Not into the room, into Ophelia's, which was bigger and had a stove, and Ophelia had the water on before the door shut, and Teodoro came with his little bag of gum and moss, and Pillar, who was 22 years old by then, and could set a bone better than the doctor in Deming, put both her hands flat on his thigh and pressed until he came up off the table, and Ozzie held his shoulders down with one good arm and his whole weight. He didn't yell, I remember that. He made a sound like a door in wind. The wound was 4 days old, and it had gone bad in the way that gets a man his leg cut off in a good hospital and gets him buried in a bad one. Pillar opened it. The smell filled that little house and did not leave for 11 days. Nadeshe did not touch him after the first minute. She stood by the door with her arms crossed hard over her chest, gripping her own elbows so tight the knuckles went pale, and she watched Pillar work, and she did not say one word of instruction, which, if you knew her, was the loudest thing she ever did in her life. Then she went out. I followed her. Of course I did. Somebody has to follow, and it's always the one holding the notebook. She walked up the low rise and past Cal's stones without stopping and kept going to the north edge where the ground fell away, and she stood there looking at the glow. It was 30 miles off, maybe more. Distance is a liar at night. It sat on the horizon like a coal going out, orange at the bottom and dirty red where the smoke took the light and gave it back, and it did not flicker the way a house fire flickers. It just breathed. I said, "That's Voss's North Camp." She said, "Yes." I said, "God, I can hear my own voice, so reasonable, so stupid," I said, "could be the grass, could be lightning." And she said, "In November." Neither of us said anything for a while after that. The wind came up off the flat behind us, and it smelled like our own place, wet ditch and wood smoke and cattle, and ahead of us the other thing was burning, and I understood, standing there with my hat in my hand like a man at a graveside, that those two smells were about to be put in a room together, and only one was coming out. She said, "6 men." I said, "What?" He said, "6. She didn't turn. There were 6 of them, there are 3 now. 3 where? North, behind him. She let go of her elbows finally and her hands hung down. They will come here, not tonight. Their horses are worse than his. I said, "Then we have to." And she turned around and looked at me and I stopped talking. And I have never in my life stopped talking so completely, before or since. "Say it," she said. I couldn't. "You are going to say we must send him away," she said. "Say it." So I said it. And she nodded like a woman agreeing with a man about the weather, and she said, "He cannot sit a horse. He cannot walk. If he goes tonight he is dead in the arroyo by morning." I said, "If he stays here, everybody." "Yes." "Nadeshe." "Yes," she said. "I have counted them too." And she went back down the rise past Cal's stones without slowing, and left me up there in the cold looking at somebody else's fire. Nav 5, he is alive, fever. Nav 6, fever. Nav 7, cut the ditch off at the second headgate to fill the low tank. Nobody asked why. Silas figured it and did not say. That's what she was doing. Nobody told me for 2 days. She was filling every tank and barrel and stock pond on that flat, and she was doing it quiet, in daylight, like ordinary work. Because if riders came and cut the acequia at the head, 4 miles up, we'd have 4 hours of water in the ditch and then nothing. And a place with no water is not a place you can be stubborn in. It is a place you leave. She did that on the 5th of November. She was making it possible to refuse before she had decided to refuse. That's the sort of woman she was, and I have never been able to make anybody understand it. Men will tell you leadership is a thing you do with your mouth. Nav 8, fever broke, he ate. I have not gone in that house. That's true, and it's the worst line in the book. 11 days he lay in Ophelia's front room and I did not go in once. I carried water to the door. I split wood. I stood in the yard. Because I did not want to know what he'd done. You understand? As long as I did not sit down beside him and hear him say it in his own language and watch Pillar's face turn it into English, he was a wounded man in a bed, and I could be a decent fellow hauling water for a wounded man. The minute I knew, I'd have to be something. Silas went in. 19 years old when he came to us, and 31 that fall, and still asking too many questions. He sat in there a whole afternoon. He came out and threw up behind the woodpile, and then he came and found me and sat down on the wagon tongue with his hands hanging. He said there was a boy at that camp, Voss's, a wrangler, maybe 17. I said, "Don't." He said, "He's dead. He run out of the bunkhouse when it lit and one of them shot him, and it wasn't, he says it wasn't him. He says he tried to stop it." I said, "Do you believe him?" And Silas, who was the dumbest man on that flat and outlived every one of us and was, I have come to believe, the best of us by a good margin. Silas looked at his hands and said, "I believe he's her brother." Here's what I did not know until years afterward, and only then because Pillar told me, at a funeral in the rain. The band had come off the mountains hungry. That's all. There were 4 families of them living in country God forgot, eating what they could take, and they had been hunted since '86, and there were maybe 30 of them left in the world, and no place on the earth would have them. They cut fence for beef, and Voss's men rode them down and killed 2, and the survivors went back at night and burned the camp. And a 17-year-old boy from Ohio, who had been in New Mexico for 6 months, and wrote his mother every Sunday, came out of a bunkhouse door with his suspenders down and a bucket in his hand. That's the whole of it. That's the entire thing, the atom of it, the piece you cannot break down any further. 2 lots of people who had been made hungry by the same arrangement, and one of them owned nothing, and neither did the other. And the men who owned it all were in Silver City, and the boy died in the dirt with a bucket. I have thought about that boy more than I have thought about my own son. They came on the 12th. Not 30 men. 9, and a deputy sheriff named Crandall with a paper, and Halbert Voss himself on a good gray horse, in a coat that had never been mended. I want to be honest about Voss. He was not a monster, and it would be a comfort to me if he had been. He was a man who had lost $1,100 of cattle and a shed and a boy he'd hired, and he was in a rage that had gone cold and clear the way rage does in certain men, and he believed with his whole soul that he was on the side of order. They came up the wagon road at 10 in the morning, riding slow, which is how you come when you want to be seen coming. She was in the ditch. I don't mean she was standing near it or by it. She had a shovel, and she was down in the acequia to her knees in November water, doing nothing that needed doing, throwing a little silt up on the bank. 60 people came out of their houses. Nobody rang anything. Nobody hollered. They came out the way people come out when they've been listening for 2 days, and they walked down to the ditch and they got in it. Ophelia in it, Pillar, Teodoro with his stick, Ozzie Merritt with a shovel through the loop of that stirrup-leather contraption she'd made him 12 years back. The 2 who'd run from the school in Albuquerque, grown now, one of them holding a baby. Silas, the storekeeper who I'd never liked. A drunk named Hollies who'd been sober 8 months. 2 brothers from Sonora. A widow. A man who had come to us in '90 with a rope burn around his neck and never once said where from. They stood in the water in a line about 140 feet long, and they did not carry a single gun. That was hers. She'd said it the year before on the step mending a bridle because too many people will be standing in it. Nobody had told them to, not one word. I'd swear it on anything you like. Voss stopped his gray horse 40 feet off. The deputy read the paper. It was a warrant. It described a man by his wound. And Nadeshe leaned on her shovel in the ditch, 61 years old, hair gone iron, hands like burnt leather, and she said, "He is in the 3rd house." I've had men call me a liar over that. They can't hold it. They want her to have hidden him under the floor and stood in front of the door. That's the story where you get to cry. But I was there in the mud and I heard her say it, and I heard the silence come down on 60 people like a hand. Because that was the second half of the thing, and I had not understood it until that second. Too many people standing in it, she meant the water. She meant the law of that place, the only law it had. Everybody who drinks walks the whole 4 miles. Everybody cleans his stretch. Nobody's water runs but through his neighbor's ground. She had built a thing where nothing could be hidden. She'd built it on purpose over 12 years out of dirt. And a man who has burned a camp and left a boy in the dirt is silt in the ditch. And if you don't dig him out, the whole 4 miles chokes, and she knew it, and she had known it since the 4th of November at dusk, and she had spent 8 days filling water tanks so that when she said the true thing her people would still be able to survive the consequence of it. Voss said, "Bring him out." And she said, "No, you will go and get him. He is my brother. I will not carry him to you." And Halbert Voss sat on his horse and looked at that ditch full of people for a long, long while. I watched his face. I have made my living reading the faces of men I'm about to trade with, and I could not read his, and then all at once I could, and what was in it was fear, not of us. We had shovels, but of the arithmetic. The same arithmetic those men used to do on the rise with their hats off. 9 riders, 140 feet of people in a ditch. A woman who just handed him the man he came for and had not moved 1 inch out of the water. He said quietly, "Ma'am, I have lost a boy." And she said, "I have lost more than you can count. Go and get him." They got him. He couldn't stand. 2 of Voss's men carried him out of Ophelia's front room, and his good leg dragged in the dust and made a line. And I watched that line all the way to the wagon, and Ophelia stood in the doorway of her own house with her fist against her mouth. He said something to his sister as they went past the ditch. She answered him, 4 or 5 words. Then he was in the wagon and the tailgate went up and Crandall put the paper away in his coat. And Voss turned his gray horse and rode north without another word. And it took 11 minutes for them to be small and 40 for them to be gone. Nobody got out of the ditch. That's what I remember. That's the thing I'd tell you if you only let me tell you one. Not one of those 60 people climbed out of that cold water. They stood there. Silas was crying without any sound at all, and Ozzie Merritt had his eyes shut and his lips going, and the water ran past their knees toward the fields, and the sun came around and the shadows of the cottonwoods laid themselves down across the line of them. She stayed longest. When she finally came up out of the ditch, her skirts were black to the waist, and she couldn't feel her feet, and she went past me and I said her name. She said, "Not now." And she went and sat down next to Cal's stones and stayed there until the stars came out, and Pillar took her a blanket and came back with it still folded. They tried him in Silver City in March. He didn't hang. I don't say that as a mercy, and I've never once been able to feel it as one. The government wanted the last of them off the mountains, and there was a policy about it, and he was made a prisoner of war along with what was left of the 4 families, 19 souls, 11 of them children, and they were put on a train. Florida first, then Alabama, where the damp got into their lungs and did what the Army hadn't managed in 10 years of trying. I do not know what happened to him. I want that plane. I made inquiries for 4 years, and I wrote to a captain, and I wrote to a man at the Indian Bureau who answered me once and never again, and there was a list and his name was on it going, and it was not on it coming back, and lists are made by men in a hurry, and I do not know. She never asked me if I'd written. Not once, in the 22 years she had left. I would come out with the wagon and she'd ask about the freight rates and my hip and whether the Deming Bank had failed, and there would be a moment every single time, I swear it, some little hitch in the talk about nothing, where I could feel the question standing in the room with us, and neither of us would look at it, and then it would go. The last time I saw her sit and cry, and it was only a minute, was in 1901 when a basket came. It came through 4 hands to get to us, and none of them could say from where. It was Chiricahua work, and it was bad work. The coils were uneven, and the pattern gave out halfway and started again wrong, and Nadeshe turned it over twice. She said, "This is a child's." She said, "This is a child who was taught by someone who was taught." She held it against her chest with both hands the way you'd hold a small animal, and she sat down on the step of the room, the original one, 11 by 12, and she put her forehead on the basket. Then she got up and put it on a shelf and went to see about a broken headgate. The water case took 6 years. Voss lost it in the end, and not one thing about that was justice. He lost it because his lawyer wrote the Kenyatta Seca in the complaint, and the ditch actually heads out of an unnamed draw a mile east that a surveyor in 1878 had drawn on a plat as a tributary of something else entirely. And by the time anyone noticed, The priority date was fixed by continuous beneficial use, and there were 61 adjudicated water rights on that acequia, and every one of them was in the name of a person who could hold one. Silas Ward, principally, Ozzie Merritt, Ophelia Vargas, who took citizenship in '96 and cried about it, and not for joy. The morning they signed the association papers, Nadeshe stood at the table in the schoolhouse, and the notary held out the pen, and she looked at it. She could read by then. Pillar had taught her at night out of a Bible and a seed catalog, and she'd been ferocious about it and hated every minute, and she could read a contract better than I could. She took the pen and she made a mark. An X 2 strokes. She set the pen down and stepped back and let them write her name beside it in somebody else's hand. A name that was not her name. A thing they'd put on a paper at San Carlos in 1878 because a clerk had a train to catch. Silas said, "Ma'am, you can write it." And she said, "He signed with a mark." And that is the whole of what she said about it, that day or ever, and she went out into the sun. And the papers said the ditch belonged to the association, and the association belonged to the water users. And there is a filing cabinet in Silver City where you may go and see it. And her name is not in it anywhere, in any form, that is really hers. She died in the spring of 1916. It was nothing dramatic. She was 83 and she'd been walking the ditch, and she sat down to rest against the bank about a half-mile up, in the shade, and a boy found her in the evening and thought she was asleep. They brought her down in a wagon with the tailgate off. 400 people. I counted because that is what I do, because my father drank his memory away and I decided I would have one thing he didn't. 411, and 30-some more came in the next day from as far as Hachita, and the schoolhouse could not hold a tenth of them, so they did not use the schoolhouse. They stood in the ditch. Nobody organized it. Ozzie Merritt was 30 years dead. Ophelia was blind. It was young people, most of them, people who had been born there and never once thought about it, who came down off the flat in their good clothes and walked into the water without a word, because that is what you did at that place when a thing was too big, and none of them could have told you why. They put her on the low rise next to Cal Reeder, head to the east, and there is a cottonwood over the both of them now that is 11 feet around, and the grass there is a different green. I can see it now. That's the joke of it. Took me 60 years and 2 cataracts, and I can stand up there in the spring and see exactly where the water runs under the ground, plain as a road. They tore the schoolhouse down in 1931 and built a brick one. There's a filling station. There's a highway sign with the name on it, Cal's Room, Pop. 380, and it's spelled wrong on the sign and always has been. Boys in cars from Deming come out on Saturday nights and drive the ditch road and throw their bottles in the water, and every spring the whole town still walks the 4 miles with shovels, all of them, the storekeeper and the doctor and the drunk, and they eat together at the end of it, and if you don't come you don't get water. Ask them why and they'll say, that's how it's always been done. I asked a man in the cafe last month who Nadeshe was. He said he thought that was Mexican for something. I'm 91. I have a bad hip and a boy comes to cut my grass, and I have 41 tally books in a crate under my bed, 1878 to 1949, and on the 14th of June in most of them there's nothing written but the date. Here is what I've come to. He built her a room they could take. He didn't know it and it wouldn't have stopped him, and it was 11 feet by 12 with a wagon tongue over the door with another man's initials on it, and it stood. And she built 400 acres of green in a country the color of a dead lion, and a ditch nobody owns, and a law made out of dirt, and she could not put her name to any inch of it. And men rode 100 miles to stand on a rise with their hats in their hands, and say they'd give anything to live there. They meant it too. That's what gets me. They meant it and they had no idea what the price had been, and they'd have paid it if they'd known. That's the terrible part. Most of them would have paid it. They were good enough for that, and nobody ever asked them to. She paid it in one morning in a cold ditch, in 8 days of quietly filling water tanks, in a name she never let me write. I've got the book open. I've had it open since supper. I know how it starts. I have known for 60 years. It's 4 sounds, and I could get the first 2 if my mouth would hold still, and I have said it out loud in this room maybe 200 times tonight, and there is no one to correct me. So I'm going to do what she did in the dirt with a whittling stick when I was young, and could not hear the difference. 4 marks. That's all. 4 marks in a tally book, and if some grandchild of mine ever opens the crate and finds them and asks what they mean, well, there's a woman in Alabama, or there was, who taught a child badly how to make a basket. And there's a green up on that rise that isn't like the other green, and it's there because of water, and the water's there because a woman lay down on her belly and shut one eye and looked at the ground until it told her the TR.